Hi friends, so I finished watching The Queen's Gambit on Netflix and I wanted to share my thoughts on just how well it was able to reflect chess both on and off the board. Also, I've compiled a list of all the games Beth played during the show to show her progression from the very start to the very finish. And if you haven't already seen the show, do please check it out before watching this video in case of any spoilers. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy the games. The show follows fictional character Beth Harmon and her struggles through life and how she finds comfort in the game of chess. It's almost like she's a female version of Bobby Fischer, since the two stories are very similar, apart from the drugs, which don't improve your chess in any way as far as I know. So I've gone through and compiled a list of all the different positions which I found in the actual show, starting with the first one. And with all chess journeys, it usually starts with Scholar's Mate, and this is where hers begins in the basement with her janitor Mr. Shaibel, who teaches her. And of course, we lose to the 4-move checkmate. Afterwards, she sort of goes back and works out how to stop it in her head, and then we get to the second game. So here in the second game, it goes something like this: e4, g6, d4, e6, queen f6, bishop g7, and then bishop g5 is in fact trapping the queen on f6. She plays the move queen takes g5, knight takes g5, and then we have a very interesting moment.
You resign now.
So I totally agree on this one, that if you're playing a much stronger player and you're a lot of material down with no chance of really coming back, then it's common etiquette to just not drag the game on. I know of a game where a chess grandmaster was playing a lower rated player with no chances of the other player of coming back, but they wouldn't resign, so the grandmaster ended up promoting all the pawns into bishops and knights, sort of to get the point across. Of course you don't have to, but I think this is sort of common etiquette. So the next game we have is also against Mr. Shaibel still, and this one black is actually winning, so it's black to move. So for each of these, I'll actually give you time to pause the video if you want to work out the solution for each one. But here with black to move and win, it's a fairly simple one. We play the move pawn to f3, hitting the knight. If the king moves, then we have a back rank checkmate. So the knight goes to e3, and here black can just capture, and then play the move pawn to f2, promoting the pawn through. So next we get into position 4. And we have white to play and checkmate here with the king in the center of the board. White can play the move queen to e8 check, knight e7 followed by pawn to d5, checkmating Mr. Shaibel. Position 5 was played against Mr. Granz. So this one continued 1 knight f3, f5, d3, d5, pawn to e4, captures. White played the move knight to e5, pawn takes, bishop takes. So if you're a beginning player, try not to push your f-pawn because of this reason, that you weaken this h5 to e8 diagonal, and a lot of bad things can happen when this takes place. After knight c6, for example, queen h5 check. I'm not sure if Mr. Granz was playing his best game here, or this was just a test. But after the g6 move, white can force checkmate by sacrificing one of his pieces. So she went for bishop takes g6, pawn takes, and queen takes g6. I noticed that she doesn't sacrifice her queen that much and often sacrifices the piece instead. So in the Simul, we are playing again Mr. Shaibel, and here it's white to play in checkmate. Again, we can actually force it one of two ways. We can play either queen g5 check or bishop g5 check. White opts for bishop g5 check, pawn takes, and queen takes g5. These are almost also famous games, by the way, if you don't recognize these positions. So position 7 is from the blindfold with Mr. Granz, and this one's a very famous position which I'm sure you've seen in almost every tactics book. So the start goes something like this, and then white castles queenside, sacrificing the knight on e4. So if black takes it with the queen, then there's rook e1, but if black takes it with the knight, then white has a very nice forcing checkmate here. So if you haven't already seen this problem, you can try and work it out. Otherwise, the solution is queen to d8 check, sacrificing the queen after the king takes. We have bishop to g5 double check. If the king goes back to e8, then rook d8 is back rank mate. And if the king goes to c7, we have a nice bishop to d8 checkmating pattern here. So after this, we get to position 8, where the games go into her playing at the Kentucky State Championships. So this is one of the first games in the tournament, and in this position here, black played the move bishop to g4, so pinning the queen, and it looks like black is winning some material here, but in fact this was all planned, and white can play the move queen takes g4, and after rook takes, we can actually go bishop to e5 check, and in fact it is black who is getting checkmated here because there's no way to sufficiently block. After queen f6, we just capture, rook g7, and then white just captures here, and we see the power of the bishops along these two diagonals. So when you play an actual competitive tournament, you do have to use clocks so that the game doesn't drag on forever, and you do have to notate your games, of course, to keep a record. The first time I played in American tournament, they didn't actually have clocks or sets provided, which was different from what I was used to in Australia, and so I actually had to borrow someone else's and use the same sort of set and clock sharing system. So the next position is actually one of my favorites in this particular tournament and the show, and the middle game reach against Towns was something like this, where black played queen takes h2, knight takes, pawn takes, rook e7, rook g2, and then the game progressed from here, and we reached a endgame such as this with white to move.
Jesus Christ, Harmon, you're humiliating my rook.
You won't have to suffer much longer.
So this is one of my favorite parts, and what Towns is actually talking about is that after rook takes h6, black can play the move king to g7, and we see that this rook is actually completely trapped and dominated despite having so many squares. So for example, the rook can't go back to h4 because knight f3 is check, so then the rook has to go to h5, but after the move king to g6, we find no matter which square the rook goes to, will end up in a fork with the king. So all the squares are covered from knight forks. These ones, for example, will all lead to one of these forks. So the rook is completely dominated here, and black is winning the rook by force. The game continued something like rook here, followed by knight to b3 check. So next we have the position against Harry Beltic, which was a very, very interesting position here. Here white plays the move bishop to e6, a really, really strong move by Beth. And the idea is that black does have this tempting check along the h file, but as we'll see, it doesn't pan out. Also, black can't capture the bishop because of the checkmating threat here, nor can black capture the rook first, because there will also be checkmating threats on f8 after the recapture. So rook h8 check, white blocks with the bishop, knight takes g6 was played, and here white has a very, very nice combination to force checkmate. Starts out with the move rook f7 check. If the queen takes, then we just a lot of material up there with a big attack. So the king goes to h6, and then Beth plays a stunning move, queen takes g6, sacrificing the queen with rook f6 check. The king goes up the board, and then we have very accurate rook f5 check first. King goes back, the other rook comes back to f6, and then the two rooks plus the bishop will force a very nice checkmate here. This is a very nice game against Beltic, and later they analyzed the middle game position, and this was the position from the middle game, and it turns out that Beth can actually get an advantage here by playing the move pawn to c4, which was mentioned by Benny, instead of taking on d4.
Chess isn't always competitive.
No, but you play to win.
Yes, but chess can also be
What?
beautiful.
So I too share this sentiment, and I really enjoyed this scene. I've always found chess a really relaxing form of escapism, just like many people use music, sports, and arts in their own lives. And just as an artist uses a canvas to build a beautiful work of art, I think why not a chess player can use a chessboard to play a beautiful game. Next we get to our position in Cincinnati. So in this particular position here, in one of the earlier rounds in the tournament, she played queen takes e5, rook takes b2 was played. So the idea is if queen takes e5, rook takes e5, and then black takes on d3, then the knight on h5 is hanging, so we can just take it, and then all the pawns will drop slowly one by one, so white will have a winning position here. So instead, rook takes b2 was played, and then the game continued, queen e6 check, which is already clearly winning for Beth, because next move will take either the rook or take the bishop on g6 with a big attack as well. So next we move on to position 14 against Benny. So this game started out in the Sicilian defense. It went something like this. So the fact that she's playing bishop c4 sort of hints at similarities to Bobby Fischer's play, since bishop c4 was his main line against the knight of Sicilian. And after castles, bishop d7, bishop g5 was played, bishop e7, and then she immediately goes bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, provoking the double pawns. And the double pawns aren't necessarily a bad thing, as we'll see, and it's explained in the show.
Planned. I went into that game with a perfect score. Benny had 2 draws, so a draw would give me the title. I wanted to win.
This is the position they reach later on, near the end, with Beth to move. And this is a very interesting moment in the game, I felt, because if you're a chess player, you've probably had this feeling many times where you have the choice of going for something you know is objectively best and may not win you the game, but it might go for a draw or something like this. Or you can go for something a lot riskier to try and win and may end up losing the game instead. So this is a very common occurrence for a lot of chess players, including myself. And here, instead of rook d8, which would be perfectly good move for Beth, but probably will peter out into a draw, instead she plays the move rook to g4, going for some counterplay and banking on the fact that maybe her opponent will make some inaccuracies, but instead black plays the accurate rook h1 check, king f2, rook check again. The game continued, knight to g2, and then after knight d3, white is forced to resign because we're just losing too much material here. So next we have the first tournament overseas, where she played Daedric, a strong master, and here she played the move pawn takes c4 and went on to convert this into a win for black. The opening, I believe, was a Queen's Gambit declined, and the next game was against Girev, a very strong, talented Russian junior player. And the game, from what I could see, came from a Scheveningen Sicilian, which starts out something like this. And after the move knight to c6, knight c3, black played the move pawn to d6, go into a Scheveningen structure. And this is a very good move order for black if you want to avoid, say, the Kirez attack with pawn to g4, since here there's no knight on f6, so it's a little bit harder to break through on the king side for white. But it goes bishop e3, knight f6, f4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight g4, queen d2, captures, pawn takes, and she plays this line as white, where I would play this myself, and I think it's a really good option since it doesn't give black too many winning tries, and it's just very easy for white to play. So I definitely recommend this line as well if you're interested in something against the Scheveningen. And the position they reached later on from the game in the end game was something like this. After the rook check, the king went back, and here the game was adjourned. So back then what that meant was you'd seal your move and put it in an envelope, and then you'd have the whole night to analyze, because they didn't have computers back then. So then you could analyze your game and then come back and resume the next morning. So the game resumed the next morning, and the move Beth found here in a relatively dry looking position was the fantastic pawn to h5. So after pawn to h5, it's clear that black is in a lot of trouble because white has some severe threats. For example, if black just casually captures, then we have to move pawn to g6, and then Beth is threatening the checkmate here on h7. If bishop g7, we have rook c8 check. Whereas if rook e2 here, we can play the move pawn to a4 just to avoid any mating threats. And I don't think this helps black that much because we still have to deal with the pawns. If instead the captures here in g5 as was played in the game, I believe it continued pawn takes g6, rook h1 to stop the mating threat, but then after the move bishop to e6, I think white has a clear winning endgame here, which white went on to convert. So next we have the game against Borgov, the first one, and this one was already severely bad for black, and in this position Borgov just finishes everything off with the move queen to f3. So that was the first loss. So next we go to an analysis game played between Beth and Harry.
What about the other bishop over
For
here?
Christ's sakes, Harry, it'll be check once the pawn moves and the knight trades. Can't you see that?
No, I can't. I can't find it that fast.
Well, wish you could.
So this one I was having a little bit of trouble with because it's not so clear if the bishop is on c2 or the bishop is on b1. If the bishop is on b1 as I think, then I'm actually with Harry on this one because after knight takes h5, I think she's referring to the move pawn to c4. And here, assuming that the rook has to move, then I think Beth is right because then there's the move bishop takes e5, hitting the queen, and then let's say the queen moves, and then there's queen takes h5. So a very strong in-between move, and then white recaptures the piece. The problem with this position here is that I think black can play the move rook takes b1. This very strong in-between move, because after queen takes b1 now, I think black is okay, because black can play all sorts of moves to get the knight to safety. Of course, if the bishop was on c2, then this wouldn't be a problem. So if the bishop was here, we could play c4, and this whole combination should work out for white. So next we move to the Simul game against Benny and his friends. So this one was the first game, and it's very interesting. White to play, and white played the move knight takes e6. So this was a game of Kasparov's, in fact, against Luke Van Wely. Pawn takes, and then rook captures on e6. King to f7, and Kasparov played the move queen to d3. Very, very strong move. The idea is that king takes e6 is well met by queen g6 check, and the attack is just too strong here for black to stop. Whereas if bishop g7 as played in the game, then we have queen f5 check, king g8, and then rook takes d5 as played, queen takes a4, and the game continued with white finishing off in great fashion. The next game was also in the Simul against Wexler, and here white just checkmates with queen to e8, fairly simple. And then we have another Simul game against Grandmaster Levertov. I'm not sure how the Grandmaster got into this particular position because the king is on d6 and it looks quite bad. So Beth played the move bishop takes f6 here, queen takes f3, and then bishop to e5 check, a nice in-between tactic. The idea is that if the bishop takes, we take back the pawn, we check, and then we just recapture the queen, and we're a piece up. Although she could have also played the move bishop to f4 here, and after king to d7, play the move rook e7, and pick up the queen on c6. So this would also have been a nice way to win. So next we go to the Simul game against Benny, and it's white to play and win here. So we can play the move knight to h5, threatening the checkmate on g7. This is the most accurate move. So the only way to stop it is to take, and then white just plays rook check, king h8, and then queen g7 is checkmate. And then the third game against Benny is, of course, you should recognize this one. If you don't, then you should check out the game Paul Morphy against the Count, of course, where Paul Morphy sacrifices his queen with queen to b8 check, knight captures, and then rook to d8 checkmate. So next we move to the games in Paris, starting with this one here, where black played the move rook takes e1, rook takes e1, and then Beth went on to clearly win this one. Of course, it's completely winning for white because black's pieces are completely tied up here on the queen side, and the king is just under a huge attack. Then we get to the game against Borgov, number 2. And here Beth plays the move queen to d4 and goes on to lose this game. Of course, it's already not so good for white. It's very bad position because black has the 2 bishops. It's also going to just capture the queen and then capture the pawn on h3 if he wants, and then should go on to convert this without too many problems because the passed a pawn can't really be used. So next we'll head to the games in Moscow, starting with this one here where Beth won with the black pieces and white resigned. Of course, white is up material, but it doesn't really help because the king has no safe spot. If the king goes to d3, then what you can do is use your queen to check on e3 and then take the pawn on e2 afterwards. And then what you can do is use your bishop to check on the dark squares and then the queen to check on the light squares, which is typically how you would effectively use a queen and bishop checkmating combination. So this next game is one of my favorites in the series, and it's the one she played against Luchenko, who's one of her oldest opponents but also a former world champion. So this is the position they reached, and in this position in the actual game I believe rook f7 was played. But after the adjournment, the next day, Beth actually played the pawn to h5 instead to try and open up the white king side. And here we feature some really interesting analysis after pawn takes. Beth played the move king to h8, sidestepping any potential threats. Pawn takes on g6, rook takes on h4. And we can see the whole point is that in bishops of opposite color positions, what you want to do is maximize the potential of your bishop and also go for your opponent's king. We see that dark square bishop is a lot stronger than the white bishop here, and also black is creating some counterplay options. But the real magic happens after rook h1, and then Beth plays the move rook to h7. So this is a fantastic counterattacking move. So if white captures on h5, we'll just on h4 we'll just capture back, and instead if white captures the rook here, then we'll play the move queen g7. And instead of defending, we've created a really dangerous counterattack on the white king. Instead, in the game, Luchenko played rook g1, and then the game continued rook h5, king back to f1, king goes to g7 to stop any pawn advances. The bishop tries to get into the game via d7, rook d4, and here's where we get the finish. After rook check, the rook goes back, and then bishop to d4 seals the win because white doesn't have any good moves here to stop all the threats of rook h2, queen takes f3, and rook takes rook threats. So now we reach into the final game of the series, which was the one against Borgov. And this was a very interesting choice because the game actually played was by Ivanchuk with the white pieces, and here's round about the time where it deviates. In the actual game played, it ended up in a perpetual and a draw, but the one in the show is more interesting because the variations lead to some very exciting chess. And round about here, after the move pawn to h3 was where the game was adjourned in the show, and both players went to analyze. And in the next day, they came back and the game continued with queen to g6. Beth played the move knight to e6, very tricky move, going for some tactics with knight to f8 after knight takes d6. Rook to a4 was played, and we get a series of forcing moves after the pawn goes to b3. Here, if black tries knight takes e4, then we have some very interesting tactics. After pawn takes rook, and knight takes g3, very interesting try here. And white can actually play a very strong move. Instead of taking the knight, which would just drop the queen here, of course, we can actually play the move knight to e7. And after queen takes queen, white can play the move knight to f8 check. The king goes to h8, and then knight g6 check would lead to a perpetual check and a draw. Instead, in the game, rook takes e4 was played, and after this, white plays the move knight takes d6 with the threat of if captures, then knight f8 check would pick up the queen on g6. So instead, bishop takes e6 was played, pawn takes on d6, pawn to e7. So both players are blitzing out at this point in time until Borgov plays the move pawn to d5, and this is a very unexpected move where Beth didn't analyze the day before. So at this point in time, she goes into a long think and then comes up with the solution of bishop to c5, a really high class move, just protecting the pawn. And the idea is that we don't want black to play the move pawn to d4 and keep our bishop on a passive square. So always use your bishops to support your passed pawns, and always keep your bishop on the most open diagonal you possibly can, and that's on c5. After queen e8, queen f3 was played with the idea of queen f5 check, maybe trying to invade with the queen. Queen goes to c6, and now the move pawn to b4, just anchoring that bishop on the c5 square. And here's where Borgov offers the draw, but of course Harmon thinks about it and then goes on to decline after queen e8 and plays the move queen f5 check. King goes to h8, and then sacrifices the queen with queen takes f6, pawn takes, and rook takes f6. And we see the point is that we're trying to make a queen with the move rook f8 check. Queen h5 is the only move. Rook f8 check, the king goes across, and then white makes a queen. So the only thing now white has to do is avoid all the checks along the second rank, and we should be fine. After rook check, the game continued king f1, queen takes h3, king takes e2, queen g2 check, rook goes back, queen e4, and king to d2 removes all the checks, and white wins the game. I thoroughly enjoyed going through all the games in this series. If you enjoyed this type of video and want more, just let me know and I can do them for next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.